Thanks so much for coming out for the annual Tisch lecture. I'm Tom James, Provost of Teachers College. I'm going to say a few words first about the Tisch series, this lecture series, and then I will introduce our speaker. Lori Tisch, for a long time, was co-chair of the Board of Trustees at Teachers College. And she is a New York City philanthropist, has a foundation that does a lot of work investing in community-based organizations, parental support of kids, which kind of relates a bit to tonight's topic, arts organizations and things like that. And so she created, when she came onto the Teachers College board, an annual lecture series where we could bring in a distinguished academic who could challenge our thinking, who could help us to sort of bring in new conceptions and new ways of thinking about things and become part of our community for a little while and really give us some ideas that we could really think about. And they've mainly been people who've been very well-known scholars from other universities. We did have one person who was an ex-prime minister of New Zealand, who was the head of the United Nations Development Program, which is like the number 3 person in the UN. But most of them have been people with distinguished scholarly careers, with work that really has high social impact, that really makes a difference in human lives. And that very much related to the mission of Teachers College. So we're very proud this year in this annual lecture to have Susanna Loeb. And she is the Barnett Family Professor of Education at Stanford University. And she has a whole lot of other titles besides that. She's running the center that you see up here, the Center for Education and Policy Analysis. Also, she's affiliated with the Stanford Center for Economic Policy Research, which is a very important center nationally and internationally in economic research. She's the co-director of PACE, which stands for Policy Analysis for California Education. And it does important studies in shaping education policy and equity in California. And so that in itself is a big role. She has a career that spans K through 12 and beyond in terms of her work as an economist. She's thought about teacher labor markets. She's thought about different parts of schooling and how they operate. She's done a lot of work on the interaction of schools and the various sectors of education policy, local, state, and federal. She is an expert on school finance, and particularly in looking in depth at what the effects are of school finance in terms of schooling outcomes. And as we're going to see tonight, she's thinking a great deal about how schools connect with communities and parents, beyond the operation of the school itself, how we can maximize participation, engagement, and support. I'm not going to say anything more about that because this is going to be new to me. And please help me welcome Susanna Loeb. Thank you.
Thanks for having me here today. I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to talk with you about the stuff that I've been doing on parenting, and particularly on how we can provide information to parents that helps them to build strong home learning environments for young children. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And there's kind of a question that underlies a lot of what I'm going to, the studies that I'm doing and the things that I'm thinking about today, and that is, why don't we do what we want to do? And this applies to a lot of different things. I think this time of year, eating is one of those, why don't we eat well? Sometimes we have this choice between, something good and cake, and we do this. We go for that immediate gratification of cake, even though that gratification is often short-lived. And it also applies regularly to issues of exercise. So why don't we exercise more? And certainly some of that is kind of the immediate gratification of doing just about anything else, but the exercise that we may want to do lying on the couch is definitely one of those things. But exercise you also have to do over a long period of time regularly, and sometimes our schedules just fill up and it's hard to put things into the schedules. This is actually a picture of my schedule. And I have something that says exercise in there, but it's hard not to fill it in. So Why don't we do what we want to do? I think those are a couple of the exercise and food are the things that come to mind immediately, but there are lots of other things. Why don't I call old friends? Why don't I clear my email box? I think I have 2,000 emails. Why don't we follow up with our children's teacher, or if you are a teacher, with our children's parents? Why don't I learn a language or an instrument? That's a big thing, but one that I struggle with all the time. Sew a button on a sweater. There are all these things that we want to do. And so what today I want to do is focus on this question of why we don't do what we want to do, but with a focus on parenting and with the goal of designing programs to support more positive parenting and hopefully benefiting young kids. Okay, so to get into how I came to this and kind of the logic is that I looked at the kinds of parenting programs that are out there, and I guess here I'm just going to give you some of the background, and that is that we see large achievement gaps across students, and I think you all know this. If you look at the difference in entering kindergarten between kids at the very top of the income distribution, whose families are in the top 10%, and those in the bottom 10%. The difference on kindergarten entry is more than a standard deviation in terms of their current achievement, and that's really a huge difference. And you can see some of these differences as early as 18 months. This second study here, the Fernald and colleagues, shows it at 18 months, and it's probably earlier. So we see these large achievement gaps that are evident early, and at least in part, that's due to really meaningful differences in parenting. So we also see for young kids, for infants and toddlers, those growing up in poor families are much less likely to be caressed, to be kissed, hugged, read to, and they're more likely to be spanked. So we see those kinds of things going on. And if you look at 4-year-olds, I think many of us that have heard this figure that by the time children are completing their 4th year, they're likely to have heard 30 million fewer words if they grew up in a poor family than in a rich family. And this came from a study, this Hart and Risley study, which followed a bunch of families and recorded the words that they heard per hour and then extrapolated that out to a 30 million word difference. And the contents of the words are different as well. So the higher income children are much more likely to get encouragement and reinforcement, while the poorer kids are more likely to get discouragement or criticism. And, they both get some of each, but the balance is really quite different. But the differences aren't all by economic differences. Just like I was talking about, we, no matter what level of income you're at, you don't often do what you want to do, and there are big differences in parenting within the same kind of economic group. Somewhat unfortunately, these things have consequences, right? So parenting really matters for children's development. You see that children who experience responsive and stimulating parental care consistently score higher on a range of measures. So we have this issue is that generally parents want their children to do well, but there's great variety of parenting that's going on. So how do we think about what we can do to help parents make different decisions, change their behavior, and increase their support for children? Okay, so underlying what this question of how we can affect parenting is this issue that in order to understand how to improve parenting for young children, we have to understand how parents make decisions about what they do. Okay, so let's think about how parents make decisions. And I was trained as an economist, and I generally start with a basic economic model that says people have goals, and then they maximize those goals given their budget constraints, given how much money they have, and given how much time they have. So let's just start with that simple idea. Now, the differences that we see in parenting are really unlikely to be due to the first of these goals. People are unlikely to have different goals. Certainly, there's some small groups that have different goals, but the vast majority of parents want very good school success, social success, all sorts of success for their children. So this is not what's driving the differences that we see in parenting and child outcomes. The second part of this is resources. here you do have an effect. There's this nice recent study of the earned income tax credit that showed that an additional $1,000 really did impact students' learning. So that money itself can matter. But it's not the focus here, and it's not the only thing that matters. So in addition, there are a couple of other things going on, even though it's not in that kind of very basic decision-making model. And the first of these is information. If you don't know what to do, it's very hard to do it. And so just as an example, if you don't really know that it's easier to influence kids when they are happy than when they're very upset, then you might try to do things that aren't very effective. Or if you don't know that rhyming can help kids to hear word sounds better and develop reading skills, you might not do those things. There's some evidence, for example, that if you give parents information about schools, they make different choices about which schools to send their kids to. So information could play part of a role in why we see different parenting going on. But even when people have full information, and this is more getting back to the issue of cake and exercise, even when they have full information, they don't always use that information in their resources to maximize their goals. There's some kinds of things that inhibit us from really doing what we want to do. And so what I want to talk about today is how we can think about this combination of information and behavior in order to create programs that better support parents. So in order to do this, I want to spend a little time thinking about the behavior part. And this next slide is going to be the densest part of this talk, so bear with me on it. Okay, so what are some of the behavior issues in parenting? The first one that I think is important to think about is the cognitive load. And that just means that when things are hard to think about, when decisions are hard to make, people tend either to freeze and not make a decision or to use shortcuts, like doing what their friends do or doing what their parents did in the case of parenting. And this can have problems because those shortcuts aren't necessarily good, and they may be particularly bad if for parents who were brought up in families without strong educational environments for kids. So cognitive load can be a problem, and there are different kinds of cognitive load. So part of it is just kind of how confusing something is. If it's more complicated and you have to search on the web, then the cognitive load is higher. But you also get you get more cognitive load and more difficulty making decisions when there are a lot of choices. There's this really great study that I love, the Iyengar and Lepper study. I don't know how many of you know it, but what they did was they set up tables of jams in front of grocery stores. And some days they put 6 different kinds of jams on those tables, and some days they put 24 different kinds of jams. And not surprisingly, more people came when there were 24 different kinds of jams, and they came and looked, and they spent more time at the table. But they were 10 times more likely to buy jam from the 6 jam table than the 24 jam table. And that points to the difficulty of making choices when you have lots of choices to make. And it's even harder, at least with the jams, they were all there. It's even harder when it's ambiguous, when you don't actually know what all your choices are. Then it gets even harder to make choices. And parenting, unfortunately, is just full of cognitive load. Choosing a preschool or a school for your child is really, really complex. So you've got that complexity. But even kind of simple things, you're having dinner and you want to ask a question. There are tons of questions to ask. If you want to think about how to discipline or how to play with your child, there are billions of choices there as well. And because of this, it's really easy to either do something else and not do what you're supposed to be doing there, or just to default to the kinds of things that you're used to. So cognitive load is a big issue in parenting. The second one is just kind of like exercise, this idea that when you have to do something over a long period of time, it's really hard to keep your attention focused on it. So one of the examples of this is savings plans. There's some nice studies, these random assignment studies essentially, where people were sent reminders to put more money in their savings plan, and that led to big differences in savings. and it didn't change their resources, and it didn't change their goals. All it did was to remind them, and it shows you how important keeping your attention is. And parenting is just one of those things. I can read to my daughter tonight, and I can read to her tomorrow night, but really I have to read to her continuously over many, many years, and it's sometimes hard to maintain that attention. Okay, the third one is issues of self-control, and I certainly have these issues. That formally this is known as time-inconsistent preferences. When you get gratification immediately, kind of like that cake, you do something even though you would get more benefit overall if you just waited, okay? So you do too little when the gratification comes later. And this is why we were talking about why we eat sweets, why we sometimes watch television when we really don't want to be watching television. It's because you get that kind of immediate gratification. And what's interesting, and this is another really fun study, is that self-control problems are particularly problematic when the cognitive load is high. When you've got other things going on in your mind, you're much more likely to do things that you wouldn't want to do in the long run. So here's this study that I love, which was done with a bunch of undergraduates. And they broke the undergraduates into groups, and some of them were asked to memorize a 2-digit number. This is really trivial, the difference. And some were asked to memorize a 7-digit number. And then they could go out to the table and choose whether to have fruit salad or cake. The ones asked to memorize the 7-digit number chose cake 63% of the time, compared to 41% of the time for the people asked, who were asked only to memorize the 2-digit number. So that when you're talking about something, when you're like parenting, where you've got all these decisions to make and the cognitive load is high, if there's an immediate gratification, you're much, much more likely to do that. And these things are really common in parenting. I know I always struggle because it's so easy for me to let my 11-year-old daughter video chat with her friends while I do the dishes because she's happy and I get the dishes done, and it's very nice. But really, in the long run, it would be better if I were interacting with her and we were doing some other things together. So this self-control issue is a big one for us to think about. So there are 5 of them altogether, which that I'm going to go through. There may be more, but these last 2 are a little more of a stretch. So I think these 3 are the most important to pay attention to, but I want to touch on these last 2. The 4th is something called loss aversion. And it basically says that we really worry about giving up something that we have much more than we like getting what is really, in all senses, seems to be similar. So, for example, there was one study where they compared 2 different kinds of performance pay for teachers. And in one of it was the typical one where if the teachers performed better, they would get some additional money. And the other one was they were given some additional money in their account, but knew that if they didn't perform well, it would be taken away. And the second one, where it was put in the account, first had big effects on what the teachers did, whereas the first one did not have any meaningful effect. So, whether or not either of those are good policies, I don't want to go there. But the issue is that we worry a lot about giving up what we have. And so if you're trying to change parenting, you have to think about what the parents are giving up, and are they having to give up things that they really care about, even if it is kind of the kinds of interactions that they have at dinner or the kinds of interactions that they have with their kids. Those kinds of things might be hard to give up. The last one is emotion. Sometimes when things seem so important, it's really easy to not pay attention to them, to just be so overwhelmed that you don't want to deal. And we see this in kids sometimes when they're kind of overall achievement at the end. They're really, really worried about this. There was a study, this study right here, where they helped students to kind of reduce the worry about their ultimate test performance by just focusing on very little achievements that really each one didn't really matter, even though the big one did at the end, and it was much more productive than thinking about this big thing at the end. So we really want to think in parenting about not making every action be so consequential. That really parenting is a bunch of very low stakes actions. And even though we care so much about the outcome, each little step we make just isn't that important. If we think it's that important, then it's really easy to freeze and not do what you might want to do if you were kind of thinking things out in a rational way. Okay, so that was the intent slide, and what I want to do now is just say, okay, given that all these things might be an issue, let's look at the kinds of parenting programs we've had in the past and how they deal with these as well as other issues that parents might have. Okay, so when I think of the parenting programs, I tend to divide them into 4 groups, but you can divide them in different ways. So I'm gonna show you them in 4 groups. The first are these typical workshops that very many schools offer to parents. You come in for a night and you learn something and you go home. Okay, these are really problematic because the people who probably most need them or we most want to reach in terms of policy focus are really unlikely to come in. They have other things that they need to do or they're just these other reasons that they come in. And on top of that, you get a lot of information at once and no help then kind of keeping your attention on it or operationalizing it over time. And generally, the assessment is that these typical workshops do very little. There are kind of more intensive workshops where people come in. Again, it's really low touch so or really low reach so that you're not getting in the people that you necessarily want to get in, but the quality of the information that people are getting are higher quality. They tend to be longer programs, and there has been some evidence that some of these are useful. The one that is probably best known is there was a study by Russ Whitehurst and colleagues about it, which is something called dialogic reading, where parents are taught how to read to their child so that they ask open-ended questions and do things like that. And they've been followed not for very long periods of time, but for a little bit, and you can see changes in parenting as a result of that. So you've got those programs, but again, it's really not reaching the parents that we might care about the most. The third kind, which is actually somewhat similar, are doctor's visits, where the nice things about doctor's visits is almost all parents bring their kids into the pediatrician. Okay, so unlike the school visits where the parents have to come in at night, when you go to the pediatrician, parents are almost always there. It has the drawback of being only once a year that they're always there, so it's not a very intensive program, but you do reach people, and the most famous of these is Reach Out and Read, the Reach Out and Read program. And so it's got this great ability for broad access, but the problem is that it's very light touch. And there haven't been any really good studies of it, but there's some kind of correlational studies. People who go to doctors that have this, the parents tend to read to their children more, and the kids do a little bit better. We don't know if that's causal, but there's a little bit of evidence on that. Okay, so we've got these 3 types, and you can see in all of them that they're unlikely to have that kind of sustained effect that's needed to keep attention, and that some of them have the problem of pretty high cognitive demand, so you're giving all of this kind of information at once. There is a kind of more effective approach that's been tried, and these are some of these home visitation programs. So in these programs, some professional goes into the home and over long periods of time, or decently long periods of time, and works one-on-one with parents. And this one does get to some of the behavioral stuff we were talking about because it sustains their attention, and when you're working one-on-one with parents, you can really help them make each of those decisions, and they found really positive effects of some of these. Now, some of the studies are old, but there was one in New York State, in upstate New York in 1978, and what's nice about that is you can follow the kids of the parents over time, and you see really big differences. It's focused on a very poor population, and you've got differences in all sorts of outcomes that we would care about in terms of less child abuse, more education, less use of welfare, all of those kinds of outcomes. You see effects. I mean, so this is something that addresses all of those issues and does reach the families that we want to reach, but it's very expensive. So it's about $10,000 a family to run one of these programs. And so while the reach that you can target, the ability to scale is pretty low. So if we go and look at parenting programs in our assessment of them, we have two issues. One is that they're kind of aimed at knowledge and skill and just kind of dump that knowledge and skill, and so don't get around this issue of cognitive demand that we were talking about. They're trying to quickly change behavior. And the second is that they're limited reach. And they're limited reach either because they require parents to come into the program or because they're so expensive that they can't actually scale to the kind of degree that we would want if we were going to have big changes. Okay, so this is where we are. So one of the options is that we could just forget about parents, given the difficulty here, and focus on early child care providers or some other kind of way of reaching kids that is kind of more easily leveraged by policy. But I think the problem with that is that parents have this potential for greater one-on-one interactivity with kids than any other kind of child care provider. That they can really work one-on-one with kids and actually be there when the kids are in the mood to do something or in a good situation to do something. In addition, parents generally have much of the knowledge and skills that they need to work with young kids, well, particularly when the children are young. Once children get older, it's harder. And they also have strong motivation because of what we were talking about, which is that parents really fundamentally care about their kids, and almost all parents do. And so it's really a shame to think that we would not work on trying to help parents help their children. Okay, so our goal is an alternative approach, and by our, I mean I'm working with Ben York, and so I wanted his picture to be up here while I was doing this because he's so important to what we're doing, and if we do good things as a result of it, much of it is due to Ben. So what is our alternative approach? Our idea is to break down the parenting complexity into small, easy-to-achieve parts, which reduce the choice. So here's something you can do, and then help parents with this over a long period of time. Okay? And the benefit of it is because we have them in these really small, easy-to-achieve, easy-to-operationalize activities or tasks that parents can do, we're reducing choice, we're reducing ambiguity, we're in that reducing the cognitive load. We're sustaining attention because we do it over a long period of time. We're actually working to provide immediate gratification. We can tell the parents they're doing good things as a result of this and do that over a long period of time to kind of increase self-control. And then as long as we continue to be positive and show that these are just low-stakes choices, each one of these are low-stakes things that they can do, we can reduce the potential problems of kind of an emotional response. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, right now, texting is an ideal vehicle for this. And so what I'm going to talk about is a program based on texting. Just to give you a sense of this, it's really high access. So unlike these programs that require parents to come into schools, we can reach almost all parents with texts. 88% of American adults have cell phones, and it's more among younger adults, such as those with young children. 98% of cell phone owners can access texts. Texts have a 95% open rate compared to 36% open rate for email, so you're much more likely to read a text than an email. And Black and Hispanic adults, who are often among those who are least likely to come into some of the school activities, text with the highest frequency. So you can really reach a broad group. It's also low cost. Most adults have unlimited texting plans, even most adults in low-income communities at this point. In addition, it's had some proven effectiveness. So texting has been used most commonly in healthcare, and most commonly to kind of nudge people to do things that they need to do over and over. So this is that part that's keeping the attention. So it's been used for weight loss, kind of reminders to drink water and to do those kinds of things that help with weight loss. Medication regimes, it's been used to remind people to take their pills or to control their sugar or to not smoke, essentially. And so we see positive effects of texting programs that nudge in healthcare. There have been fewer in education, but there have been a couple. There have been some that remind kids that they're going to college during the summer before college so that they actually end up going in the fall. And then the one that's most like ours, Peter over here, did. And in this one, it's really a terrific study. And what he did, and I hope I don't get this wrong, is in a high school in LA, he randomly assigned parents to either receive or not receive texts when their children's assignments were missing or late. And as a result of that, he found really kind of impressively big effects on children's GPA and even test scores, even achievement in math for high school students. And so this is just kind of the best study that we have right now that shows the potential ability to change parents' behaviors through texts. Now, one thing that I want to note in comparing what we're going to do to what's been done before is that the vast majority of the texting programs that have come before are these nudge programs aimed at keeping attention. Okay, so exercise, 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 don't smoke, don't smoke, don't smoke kind of programs. Not that those aren't good, I think they are. Most of them are nudges. Nudges hold attention, and we want to do that. So part of what we want to do is hold this attention. But we also want to provide information. We also want to reduce the cognitive load of having to make choices. We also want to provide gratification. Basically, we want to reduce the impact of delayed gratification, saying things like, you're doing a good job preparing your child for kindergarten. And we want to calm negative emotional responses. So it's similar in some ways, and it's different in other ways. Okay, so let me tell you now about the first round of the program that we put together, and we called the program Ready for K. And in round one, we did a school year-long text messaging program for parents of 4-year-olds. And our focus was on literacy, on early literacy. So we covered a wide range of early literacy skills. We went to the research on literacy development and parenting practices and behavior change to put this curriculum together. We linked it to the California Preschool Learning Foundations, and then we got feedback from a range of experts from the school district, San Francisco Unified School District that we worked with, Raising a Reader, Jumpstart, and academics both at Stanford and at the University of San Francisco. So we got a lot of feedback on it, and then we piloted it in a local city in Redwood City, just to kind of create the first round of this. Nonetheless, we're going to do an evaluation and implementation of something that really had no, it was just the first round. It had no track record. We created it in English, Spanish, and in Chinese because of the population in San Francisco. Okay, so here's the design. So it was a 3-day-a-week texting program, and it went through the whole academic year. And texts, as many of you know, are either 140 or 160 characters, depending on which platform you're on, and we have both of those for the different platforms. So that's the basic idea. And we sent, on Mondays, we sent what we call fact tips. And fact tips are basically information. They tell you about a certain kind of skill, like, I don't know, rhyming or word sounds or beginning word sounds or something like that, so that it just tells parents that this part of early literacy is important and it's there for information and to generate buy-in. Then on Wednesday, we give them what we call a tip, which is a very specific thing that they can do with their kids that's easy to implement. And that's supposed to minimize the cognitive load. Then on Friday, we give a growth tip that says, you're doing a good job preparing your child for kindergarten, and we give them a second tip, a second thing that they can do. And then we do this over 8 months to hold attention. Okay, so let me give you just a few examples of the literacy ones. Some of them focus on specific skills. The fact text here is letters are the building blocks of written language. Children need to know letters to learn how to read and write. The tip is point out the first letter in your child's name in magazines, on signs, or at the store. Have your child try. Make it a game. Who can find the most? So the idea is to have it be kind of fun and interactive, as well as to fit into their daily routines. Then growth, keep pointing out letters. You're preparing your child for K. Point out each letter in your child's name and ask what sound does it make. Okay, so these are pretty simple. Some of them emphasize conversations. Having conversations with your child can enhance his or her verbal skills and confidence. Talk to your child often and ask questions. Tip during a meal, ask your child what's your favorite food, why. Now tell your child what your favorite food is and why. Growth, keep having conversations. You're preparing your child for K. It has a kind of ring to it, I guess. Now ask, what was the most fun thing at school today? Why was it fun? And then sometimes what we did was we tried to work with routines and get multiple skills in at once. And here's one on bath time. I'm not going to read through it all, but we say that bath time is great for teaching children important skills. And then we give a skill, and then by teaching at bath time, you're preparing your child for K. Next time, ask questions about body parts. Where's your elbow? What do they do? So we try, this is more a conversation. This was a specific one on letters, but this is part of the kind of spiral that we try to get in there. Okay, so we did a pilot and an implementation. I really want to emphasize that this is a pilot. We only had 440 families, and it was the first time that we put this in. But we worked with the San Francisco Unified School District, which we work with regularly, and they operate 21 standalone pre-K programs, as well as 13 pre-Ks within schools. This was in the 2013-14 school year. We enrolled families during preschool enrollment, and one of the nice things about texting is that you can enroll, and with partnering with districts, is you can enroll people in the program when you're enrolling them in preschool or some other kind of program, and you can get really large numbers of families in that way. It's the study was a randomized control study within sites, so we randomized within sites. Half of the parents received our Ready for K curriculum, and the other half, because they signed up to receive texts, we had to give them some texts. So once every 2 weeks, we sent them a text. And most of those sent them to the San Francisco Unified School District website to point out things like the calendar or the standards, things like that were meant not to increase interactivity between parents and children. Here's an example of one of these placebo texts, and here it says, students new to San Francisco are required to have a whole series of vaccinations. Okay, so maybe we would have an effect on whether they got vaccinations or not, but we haven't looked at that. Okay, so here are some results. So the first thing we did was to survey parents, and we asked them whether they liked the texts, essentially. And everybody, even the control families, really liked the texts. So, but nonetheless, the treatment families liked it more. And these are in standard deviation units, so about 20 to 50 or to 60% of a standard deviation. When you received Ready for K text, did you read them? They were more likely to read them, more likely to use them, more likely to find them helpful, and more likely to recommend them. So that's just the first thing we asked. The second thing we asked was what they did at home. So the families who received it let us know that they looked at pictures in a book with their child more, pointed out 2 words that begin with the same sound more, pointed out 2 words that rhyme more. And so they reported on really every measure, though the ones that are light are not significant, that they did more with their children. This we really like because at least it reflects the fact that parents have internalized them. They may think that that's what we want to hear, so it may not be the kind of best measure that you want, but it does mean that they actually read them and thought about them. The other survey we did I really liked, and that is that we asked the teachers whether the parents came in and talked to them more. And the teachers didn't know whether the parents were treatment or control. And what we found is that, again, it was positive on everything that we asked the parents, but significant, everything that we asked the teachers, but significant on some. So the teachers said that the parents, basically we had a survey that for each child in the class asked them whether the parents came in and did these different things. And so for the treatment families, they were more likely to say that the parents had come in to ask what the child was doing in school, how they got along with others, things that they can do to help their child learn. So they were, the teachers themselves saw a difference in what the parents were doing. And then finally, we did an assessment of the children's early literacy. And we didn't actually have the greatest control, so not everybody was matched, and we got more of one group than another. But once there was a bunch of the tests where we had the exact same number of treatment and control families in, and it was about 70% of both, so it's a pretty big number. And what you see is that on their overall averages, the children whose parents received Ready for K-Text scored higher in literacy, in the literacy assessment overall, and it's driven by better knowledge of uppercase letters, lowercase letters, and letter sounds. All of those things were significant. Okay. So what are our conclusions from the pilot? Well, the first conclusion was, wow, that was really great. And what we were amazed at was how much the parents loved it. So the parents really loved doing it. But I think our first conclusion is that texting can affect parenting and child outcomes, even in an unrefined program in its first year. The second is that the costs are minimal. In San Francisco, we spent less than $1 per family to send the text messages. That's partially because it was a particularly, it was a platform with very little options. As we go to other options, the texting platform is it can cost more, but never more than $5. So usually about $2 or $3. And as the numbers go up, the costs drop. The parents are interested. There was big demand. Almost all parents that we asked opted in, and little dropped out. We had 9 dropouts during the year from there, and I'm not quite sure why those were there, but they were there. And just as another example, we just offered this in the Dallas Unified School District, and we offered it to something like 3,500 parents, and 3,400 parents opted into it. So it's really, the parents tend to take it up. In year 1 in San Francisco, we offered a stipend because we didn't know if the parents had unlimited texts, but we withdrew the stipend in the second year, and it didn't affect enrollment. So I think kind of the big conclusion of this is while many parenting programs are problematic, parenting interventions can be promising if we can break down some of the behavioral barriers. Okay, so that's I think what we got from the first pilot. So where do we go from here? There are so many options and opportunities that actually, in all honesty, we're kind of struggling with figuring out what to do. But let me just run you through some of the ones. First, like how we see the options, and then what we're really doing. So there's lots of work to be done just refining the literacy text. We're not quite sure we're targeting the right skills. We're not quite sure we're targeting the right level for the students that we have. And you can imagine that it would be even better if it was differentiated somehow so that it would reach students at different levels. We can also do an expansion on topics. So there are, again, lots of topics, but the ones that we've had the most interest in or the most demand for are math, social emotional, and creativity. And so there's just kind of endless possibilities on things you can do on topics. On reach, so what we did initially was work through school districts, and school districts are great to work through, but you can't get to really young kids through school districts. So there's also this kind of diverse pre-K sector that we would want to get to, and childcare sector. They're informal caregivers, and what we're trying to do is work with some community centers to reach some informal caregivers because of kind of the vast difference in quality between the kinds of care that kids are getting in centers and they're getting it from informal caregivers right now. We can go through pediatricians like the Reach Out and Read program we talked about, and there's just lots of places we can go in terms of reach internationally as well. Then there's age range expansion. We're working on 3 to 5-year-olds essentially right now. But you can even imagine, again, parents still have most of the knowledge they need for infants and toddlers. And so that would be another really interesting place to go. And you can also go higher. I've actually done some information programs for parents around school choice when kids get older, and just trying to think about what parents do when they're older that would be helpful with because they don't necessarily have the skills that they need to really help with some of the content when the kids get older. And then finally, I think it's important to think, like, I think one of the great parts about texting is that we were forced to 140 or 160 characters, so we couldn't be complicated, and that actually helped us. But you can imagine a case after parents are used to this that you would then want to link it to other things and kind of scaffold richer material onto it. There are a bunch of apps available to parents and ways that you can access videos, but those are pretty cognitively demanding. Most of them, apps are, I think for me, particularly cognitively demanding. But we don't want to do that right away because we think the simplicity is what drives it. But I do think that eventually, once parents are used to it, we can link it to richer materials, link it to kind of local resources, other things that are going on that could be useful. And then there are a range of other technologies that eventually are going to come out. I mean, texting is good right now, but we'll always get this question about what about when texting ends? Well, the hope is that when texting ends, at least we know about what parents need so that we can apply new technologies there. Okay, so that's kind of how I view what we could do. In the year since the pilot, we've been doing, I guess, 3 things. And the first is just expanding the reach. So for this year, we're serving about 30,000 families in 20 states. And the majority of these come through school districts and are part of a study. So the nice thing about school districts is that you can enroll them. A big chunk of this comes from, actually it's not a school district, but it is the Universal Preschool Program in South Florida. Because everybody enrolls in preschool online, you can ask online if they want to enroll in the text. And we did that, and we have almost 17,000 families just who were enrolled in preschool and then enrolled in this there. But we're also just have a dial-in number, essentially, a text-in number. So if any of you want to receive these texts, you can sign up for Ready for K by texting Ready for K to 313131. Now, a caveat on this is that we started the program in October, and so you're going to get it partially part of the way through. Eventually, we'll get set up so that we can do this, but our capacity, let's just say, is a little limited right now. But you can still text in, and we have, I think, close to 2,000 families in Georgia. We sent the flyers around in Georgia who have signed up for it that way, which just kind of shows that there's a real interest in parents for the kinds of low-pressure, useful kinds of information that you can get. Okay, so we expanded reach. We've also developed math and social-emotional texts. I have no idea how long I've gone. Because this started, I think, when I showed up here at Teachers College. So, 10 till. Okay, good. So we developed math and social emotional texts. I'll give you just an example of each. So the math, the concept of more or less is important for learning later math skills like addition and subtraction. It helps children think about the world. Compare groups at home. Ask, do you have more pants or shirts? Have them check by counting. Think together about why you have different or the same amount of pants and shirts. And then keep comparing. You're preparing for K. During bath time, put water in 2 plastic cups. One with more, ask which has less. Can you make them the same? This has plastic cups. Very, very few of our texts require any kind of thing that they need to have, any kind of prop. But this is one that I liked so much because my kids liked cups in the bath so much that I couldn't not put it in there. So we have another on counting. In social emotional, here's one. Clear, simple directions are easier for children to understand. Keep requests short and specific, or keeping requests short and specific will help your child will help your child learn routines more easily. I think I had a typo here. Tip, break down the bedtime routine into specific requests. Instead of get ready for bed, try please put on your PJs, please brush your teeth. So we're trying to do those kinds of things. There's another one here that talks about recognizing emotions. So all emotions are important. Teaching children to accept their emotions helps them calm down more quickly. A tip is describe how your child feels. This shows them you understand their feelings and helps them to calm down. I can see you feel mad. Those kinds of tips. And we actually have now a collaborator with a specialty in early childhood social emotional development who helped us with this because we couldn't have done this one. Okay, so we developed math and social emotional text, and we're using them in some of the programs that we have right now. And then we began these studies to understand parenting and relevant barriers better. And I think this is important because one of the great things about the ease and scalability of texting right now and about parents' interest in this is it gives us this learning opportunity. We're in a great position to figure out, to identify what the key barriers are. For example, one of the things we're trying in a subgroup in Florida is that instead of our fact tip growth, where we're trying to get all those things in, we just have tip, tip, tip. And we do tip, tip, tip because that shows, well, maybe it's only cognitive load. Maybe they have the information. Maybe they don't need that gratification. But then maybe they do. So we can make those kinds of comparisons. We can also only provide information. So we can just, if you look, there is a texting program called Text for Babies, which is for the first year of children's lives. That's just generally an informational texting program. It doesn't give any tips. Okay, and so that might be enough, but we don't know yet. So this gives us that opportunity to learn. We can also learn about parenting. So is it better that the parents do something like what we're working on specific skills of name writing or letter recognition, or should they really just be having conversations and developing those kind of closer parent-child relationships? We can test those kinds of things. And we can also test about learning. So we have one thing that we're hoping to do where in the first year we just do social emotional, and then in the second year we do literacy. And we compare that to doing literacy both years to understand whether it's really important to get some of those social emotional skills and understandings down before moving into literacy or not. So you really have these kinds of lots of learning opportunities so that when things move into another kind of technology that comes up, we're in a better position to design a curriculum that helps parents and to use or develop new technologies to support parents. So just as the final takeaways, and I think this is really what I want you to take, or what I take from what we've been doing over the last couple of years. And that is that first, parents offer unmatched opportunities for children, that they are really in a great position to help young children. But parenting requires cognitive effort, it requires attention, it requires delaying gratification, it requires flexibility, and it requires emotional control. And all of these are big behavioral barriers. And so when we think about parenting programs and why they haven't been so successful, it might be tempting to say, well, we need to do something that's much more intensive with parents, and that's the only way to get things to change. But more intensive, I guess I should finish that sentence, more intensive approaches to change may not be more effective. Breaking down the complexity and engaging with low touch over long periods of time might actually be more promising. And we're in a really exciting time to do this because of the new technologies we really have reached that we've never had before. So that's the takeaway that I have. Thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to having a conversation. So I'd be happy to take questions if anybody has questions here. Yeah.
So could you give us sort of a sense of the common sense magnitude of those changes? Maybe repeat the question.
Yeah, so he asked me the common sense magnitude. So on some of those areas of early literacy, it was 2 to 3 months of learning for kids. So these were decent size effects from this kind of program. Oh, sorry that I went into the 7 o'clock. Yeah.
Sure. Just wondering a couple of points. One about how you might incorporate, the parents have had a very hectic day, the child's had an intense day, how you might help parents and kids with the relaxation so they learn a little better. Second, about how you sift through information. So for example, in exercise, there's so many competing ideas about exercise. One of the examples you use, how you sift out the best information. And third, well, 3 and 4, so say things like with children a little older, with things like the affective touch, how you talk about the bond. And fourthly, when let's say it's a little older child maybe, that the child would get to say choose some of the time. Here are a few activities that you might pick from so that the child might be empowered and motivated to learn by getting to pick between a few things. If you could talk about a little about those topics.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'm going to hit on all of them, but they do very much fit with the curriculum that we've been using for the social-emotional texts. So some of them have things for parents, like you were talking about, which basically says take a breath. If you take time for yourself, don't. If things are stressful, don't feel under pressure. And we like those. There is this kind of tension when you're telling parents what to do for themselves, or you're giving them ideas what to do for yourselves. We want to make sure that we don't turn parents off too much, and so that's why we run them through a lot of, as much as we can, we get feedback on the different ones and whether they seem like ones that parents won't like. But we're trying to incorporate a lot of what you're talking about. So there's a lot about children making choices. There's a whole sequence of them, which I can show you if you're interested. Some of them are around, there's the basic choice of would you rather have broccoli or green beans. Giving kids choices that are both okay for you. As one way of kind of empowering them to make choices, and also getting their buy-in. So we have a few different ones on choices. I wish Sherry, who is our emotion person, was here, who would know that. We have some on parents taking a step back. We have some on that it's easier to work with children when they are not upset, so that there are times when you just don't want to be working very much on those kinds of things. And can you remind me your other questions?
Oh, okay. Just on the choice thing, I meant, for example, so the child feels empowered, like mommy can read to you for 5 minutes, or mommy can sing to you, or you can do your ABCs with mommy, that the child can pick an activity in that way or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we definitely have texts that say that choice helps, that it's important to give kids choices, and that by giving kids choices, you're more likely to have them do what you want them to be doing.
Sure. I guess the last one was just the social affect. If you could maybe say a specific example of how you might talk a little bit about that. I meant the hugging or some of those topics.
Yes, so we have a fair amount on praising, and we have some on hugging, but I'd actually have to look to see exactly what's in there. A lot of it comes from child-parent therapy, interactive therapy program, and so we used a lot of what's recommended there to then build the text out. You're probably more familiar with this than I am.
really think, I really like the idea of using text, since so many young parents are into texting, and also breaking down tasks. I think that's very important because people do get overwhelmed. But I do wonder, is there anywhere in your study where you actually ask parents what their needs were and have them tell you? Or was it like a top-down stuff where you just made assumptions, and some of them are good, about what you thought parents' needs were and children's?
Yeah, so that's really a great question. And so when we were designing it, we got a lot of feedback from parents. We actually went to the local libraries when the parents came in for programs with their children and asked them there. But we also did rely a lot because there's fairly strong literature on some of these things for parents. However, for informal care providers, we really felt that there wasn't anything there that would really talk about need. So we're doing it more intensively for them, which is through community centers where we are identifying at least 20 informal care providers, and we're going in with them in the beginning to see what their needs are, then developing a texting program, interviewing them again halfway through, and then at the end again, so that we, through that way, really get a sense of what's going on, because we felt that there wasn't nearly enough there that would really tell us what the informal child care providers' needs were. Some are grandparents, some are babysitters, some work with more than just one or two kids, and that's a group that we didn't know about. But the sense from all the people that we had working who gave us feedback on the text, they had a lot of knowledge of kind of the parents that we were particularly interested in, which was the ones initially in San Francisco, and now we're working in the different places that we're in. We're relying a lot on our partners, so often pre-K providers. We're working with a bunch of Head Starts for them to let us know more than for us to go in. That said, we do survey parents partway through to ask them what their needs are. Even simple things like when we first did it, we sent the text at 10 in the morning, and then we got a lot of feedback saying, give it to us at 4 at night. So now we get text at 4 at night. So they're just little things like that. Okay, that sounds great.
Just wondering if you can talk a little bit about peer pressure as parents for parents, how that impacts parent communication.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends a lot on the community. So we're actually doing a little bit in rural China, and there is a lot of interaction for parents in villages. So if one gets it, other people are interested, and it's shared. In some of the more formal pre-Ks in the US, we haven't seen as much interaction. Many of the parents said they shared the text, but they didn't necessarily share it with other parents in the classroom. It was more among family members and things like that. So our hope is someday to see if we can do it kind of at this leads me to something else, but whether we can do it in a group and see if we can get enough parents in an area that have it, that it spreads to parents even that we don't have. So that's one thing. The other is, what we're trying to do with texts is to make it easier for parents to do what they want to do, but we also want to get them in new habits. And our hope is that through this program, if it's long enough, they'll get used to asking their kids questions. They'll get used to using time in different ways, so that the effect isn't only kind of the effect that we have in that year, but kind of changes parenting practices more over the long run. Okay, I'd love to talk with any of you who want to. Okay.
I'm just going to say a quick word that if you have other questions and would like to come up and have a discussion with Susanna, she's going to be here for a minute. But thank you very much for coming to this event, to the Tisch lecture, and thank you for your participation. Good night.